Good morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad that you have made the connection and are with us today. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and my co-host and co-producer is Melissa Stanton Adams, who is the president and executive director of the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute. Welcome, Melissa. So glad that you're here, Melissa. We're having technical difficulties today.
Sorry about that.
No, there we go.
That was a human error.
Good. So we've been having fun this morning already, ramping up for today's show. So good morning, Melissa. I'm so glad you're here.
Good morning, Lori. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we're going to be talking. It's the first Saturday of the month, so we talk about racial healing.
Yes.
And we've been doing this for the year. We've been going through the book, The Racial Healing Handbook, and it's by Dr. Annalise Singh, and it has all kinds of wonderful practical activities to help challenge privilege, confront systemic racism, and engage in collective healing. And part of the work that we're doing is on radio, and part of the work that we're doing is working with a webinar series that you've developed, right?
Yes. We've actually had folks in a series of 4 workshops. We're on our 3rd workshop, and it's been really interesting to have these conversations. It's called Racial Healing Dialogue Series, and it's really less of a training and more of an opportunity for people to get together and talk and make connections.
And we had encouraged all of the folks that were part of that group to call in today. But we've had some technical difficulties with our call-ins. So what we'd like to do is we still want to hear your voice, even though we can't hear it literally. But we'd like to have folks, whether you're part of the racial healing work group or you're hearing what we're having to say today, to either give us a message on Facebook, and you can go to the Connections Radio Show on Facebook and put your questions or your comments. Or you can go to my email, which is really simple, Fitz, F-I-T-Z, radio@gmail.com. And we've got folks that are going to be watching both the Facebook and my email to help, get your thoughts. And Melissa and I will voice those thoughts on the radio and talk about them today. So I'm sorry that you're not going to be able to call in. When Melissa and I get together again, we will have the opportunity to have the call-ins and you can hear the voices. But you'll at least hear comments and ideas from the folks who've been going through the series of webinars and as Melissa said, it's not really a workshop where you go to teach. It's a workshop where we come and collectively share our journey. And this is part of sharing the journey. And what we plan to talk about today is looking at grief. On April 20th, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict, and Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts, becoming the first white Minnesota police officer to be convicted of murdering a black person. And Melissa and I have talked about how even though that occurred, there's still a grieving. There's still a hole that's there. Tell us what you think about that, Melissa, what you've been processing in terms of the George Floyd, the whole trajectory of George Floyd, but recently... Looking back
it's been quite a few years, hasn't it? It has been. So we started with COVID-19, and I heard on the radio on Associated Press yesterday that America has lost the most people in the world to COVID.
600,000.
Yeah, that's over 500,000 people. Then you go, and now you think about, that's a lot of people to grieve, right? You know how many people were attached to that 600,000? They had family members that are grieving.
And disproportionately hit people of color.
Right?
Yeah.
If you did the math on that, what would that be? How it would be probably 2 million people.
Right, with the connections.
To that.
Yeah.
Right. So then thinking about those connections. Then when we got to Memorial Day and we saw a little bit of a lift on our COVID-19 ban, that our governor had put in place. We saw the murder of George Floyd happen on television.
Right.
And when black people and people of color and BIPOC people and anyone sees a traumatic experience like that on television, but specifically people who have been experiencing that sees that on television, it re-traumatizes them and puts
Good
them
point.
in a space of, right, grief. Then we saw the civil unrest, and then we saw the storming of the Capitol. We saw the nonsense that came out of the election, where I remember the 2016 election, people were, the day after when we found out who our president was, there was a lot of grief. So for 4 years, people were going through the stages of grief. And then we come to today. Look at all of the things that have happened. We just recently are now talking about the death of Dante Wright and this 14 or 16-year-old girl who was killed. And we continue to hear these names of people who are being killed. And we continue to go through this grief, right? So I thought that Annalise Sink's chapter on grieving and racism, I thought it was pretty apropos.
What is your thought in terms of how grief may be able to provide a deeper access in understanding racism?
I think that's a great point, right? Because as we think about it, grief, first of all, we have to think about where does that grief come from, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can look at it and say, I'm grieving and losing this and feeling this pain, but you also are learning. You're learning to recognize your body's emotions and feelings, and you're learning that there's something that you're not comfortable with. So what are you going to do about it?
I think also there's a part of allowing ourselves to grieve, and that we push back on grieving thinking that we either we don't want to because it hurts, and so you push it away, or the grief is so large you're afraid of opening it up. But grief allows change to happen. Grief allows, the stages of grief, which we'll get into in some further segments, allows us to process it. And if we never allow ourselves to grieve about how racism hurts everyone and how we are hurt by racism, we're denying that opportunity to heal.
Yes. And we need that.
But it's scary to get in touch with our feelings in general. People if they're happy feelings, it's not hard to get in touch with. But when we're having really challenging, tough, down to our core, how do we feel about this? There's a lot of social and cultural norms around what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and what we've been taught growing up about what it means to grieve and is it okay to grieve.
Yeah. And I think part of it, too, is thinking about racism and grief is kind of weird. You don't really put those two together. But when it comes to the losses you experience because of racism, it's important to grieve that. You lose relationships, you lose connections, you lose friendships, you lose knowledge, you lose access, and that's for whites and blacks and Asians and Hispanics. If you're not making connections with people from other races, you are losing out.
But there are differences culturally on grief, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Yes, it is. I know that when I was younger, I really was into the Bible and would read the Bible a lot. And I remember reading that in the Bible that a father lost his son. His son died. And the way he expressed his grief was for him to wail and tear his clothes. Mm. Like to rip his clothes off of himself. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you could just close your eyes and imagine a father wailing like that and ripping his clothes to shreds, is that a way to grieve or what? Like that's an expression of grief right there.
I mean, I just don't think our society today allows for that kind of deep emotional
No.
response. I mean,
No.
I remember growing up and, all the kids in our family were told like, don't cry. You've got to be brave, you got to be strong, and so don't do that. You've got to get over it, and it's it's the sense of like if you are strong if you don't show emotions, and I think that stunts actually strength.
Yeah.
It hides it and it buries it so that it never gets to be released, and it's always there at some level.
Yeah, I remember when I was a little girl, my grandmother died. My father's mother, he loved his mother so, so, so much. He was the oldest boy. So he became the man of the house after a while, after my grandmother and my grandfather got divorced after the war. And when my grandmother died, my father did not know how to express his grief because all his life he was told that men don't cry. And it was I remember him talking about how difficult it was. He said, I'm not supposed to cry. I'm not supposed to cry. And we had to kind of sit down and have a really deep conversation with him to help him understand that he needed to express his grief this way. Otherwise, he could express it in other ways that could be harmful to himself.
And I think in our Twin Cities, getting back to the George Floyd murder, we as a community are still grieving and trying to name what that grief is. And later in the show, we're going to be going through the stages of grief and applying them to racism. We're also going to, in our next segment, look at naming the grief. What does the grief look like? A little bit more about maybe how we were all taught. Melissa and I just shared a little bit about our own experiences in growing up, but we'd love to hear from you all about what your experience was in grieving and growing up, and what was acceptable and what wasn't it, and how is this loss in grieving impacting our greater vision of anti-racism. So these are all big subjects. A lot of feeling, a lot of impact. We do have someone from our group who has shared his thoughts that we'll open it up with in our next segment. Our friend Kent Hunnell has some great insight about heritage is not history. So we'll share that at the beginning of our next segment. We encourage folks to either, again, go to the Facebook Connections Radio Show and give us a thought or a statement or a question, or you can send the email to fitsradio@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us in this conversation as we explore how grief and racism are intertwined, and dealing with grief and dealing with racism helps us heal and move forward. So thanks for being with us today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Lori Fitz, your host. And my co-host and co-producer is Melissa Stanton Adams, who is the president and executive director of the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute. Hey, Melissa. It's the first Saturday of the month, and it's time for us to explore and discuss and encourage racial healing.
Yes. And, I was thinking about the whole idea of grief and why it comes about, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the whole idea of racial healing, right? And healing from racism is not just about what you know or what you do, but it's also about what you feel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have been doing this based on a conversation we had last fall in looking at the handbook, the Racial Healing Handbook by Dr. Annalise Singh, which we highly recommend, has wonderful activities, ultimately to help support a collective healing. And Melissa's also been inspiring a group that has been joining for 2 sessions looking at racial healing. And the chapter that we're dealing with this week is grieve and name racism. And I wanted to share Kent Honnold's reaction to what we've been sharing so far. And he shares, thanks for the opportunity to chime in. Just before the program, I heard another radio program that pointed out the distinction between heritage and history. It seems like clinging to heritage is a way to shield ourselves from the grief we are confronted with. If we really look at our history, our reluctance to do the grieving keeps us stuck in a place where there can be no real progress. It only perpetuates the status quo. And then he followed up by saying, I'm realizing that grieving needs to happen for people harmed by my ancestors' actions, as well as grieving for my own attachment to heritage, not history.
Yes. He put it so beautifully.
Yeah.
And I think the point, I'm sorry, Lori, the point that I like that he made is that he has to grieve too.
Yep.
He's not just saying, oh, I'm grieving for my black brothers and sisters. He has to do some grieving for himself, and I'm so proud of him for saying, I'm going to grieve as well.
I think that was my aha moment as I've been working on this chapter with you, Melissa, is the deeper idea that in my past looking at grieving about racism, it had an element of, I'm sorry this has happened to others. I'm sorry that my ancestry was part of hurting your ancestry. And because of that, there's been a systemic racism and institutionalized racism that we need to look at and change. But it was always about, I need to correct in some way, and I haven't been harmed. I've been given all these privileges. Now, it's true that I've been given privileges, but I've also been hurt. I've been hurt because I have not been able to have the rich connections and be able to celebrate with you on equal footing, and I have to recognize that my ancestors were part of a dehumanizing. All I can put is it's dehumanizing, and it's actually a violence. A violence occurred that has to be corrected.
And Lori, what you just did, I think hopefully our listeners of color are also feeling what I'm feeling, which is like this hopefulness, this joy. Because I always tell people the best way to get over our challenges around racism is to, one, acknowledge, which is what Lori Fitz just did. She acknowledged that there is a system in place that is holding people of color, BIPOC people back. And then validate my feelings. She's validating that these things are bad, that it's hurtful, and that it harmed my people. And then she did it in a compassionate way. She didn't say, well, all right, you people have problems, and maybe my people might have had something to do with it. No, she was very compassionate about the way she expressed it. If you can acknowledge and validate racism in a compassionate way, you're making a step towards changing our future.
Well, I think it's also a step in recognizing that even in the compassion of grieving for racism for others, it still creates an us and them. And so how do you break down the us and them and go, we're all hurt here, and we got to do something about it, and what are our actions? What voice can we give now that we recognize what's the next step in giving voice? And I believe in sharing stories and having a sense of connectedness through story, we begin to heal, and we begin to feel the us. We begin to feel the connection, and we move out of the isolation.
And just real quick, I'd just like to say some things about how racism harms white people. We know racism harms people of color in a very hard way. People are being killed in the streets by police officers and civilians. People are being attacked on a regular basis. But how does racism harm white people? How do white people experience grief and loss related to racism? Here are a few examples. Feeling guilty that you were taught in implicit and or explicit ways that you were better than people of color. Feeling guilty about making a racist comment. Feeling afraid to make a mistake when it comes to racism. Feeling angry that you have to work on your racism. Minimizing the dominant role and related privilege that you have in racism. Fearing challenging another white person's racist attitudes, thoughts, or behaviors, going back and forth about whether you can use your white privilege to make social change, and being so angry about an incident of racism that you get stuck in that anger and don't actually take action to challenge it.
Wow, that's a continuum to spend another radio show on. I mean, and let's continue that conversation and let's bring those points up again as we look at the stages of grief in racism.
Yes.
Because I do think that even you and I in the last session when we were talking about the different feelings that we had, I was in the anger stage and you were in the depression stage, but I don't think we named it that way.
Right.
How do we start looking at the different stages? And I think I've been guilty in the past of just being angry but not knowing what to do.
Yes.
And if you're angry, you're still in some of the early stages of grieving. How do you get to the point where you're accepting the world and you create a plan of action of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? And be able to be brave enough in your brave space that you like to create. We'll talk about brave space also in the next segment. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily safe space that we go into, but we go into a brave space to make a difference. So stay with us. We'll be talking about the stages of grief and how that relates to racism in our next segment. Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to having you come back in just a few minutes. To Connections Radio Show. I'm so glad that you joined us and are with us on our Connections journey. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and my co-host and co-producer is Melissa Stanton Adams. She is the president and executive director of the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute. And today we're talking about grieving and naming racism in that grief. Melissa, I know that you've had a chance to go down to the corner by the Cup food store where there is so much community, collective remembrance and a sense of sacredness when you go there. But there's also grieving. When I've been there, there's a sense of getting in touch with that grief. And go for it.
It's the site where George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin, former officer Derek Chauvin, and it has been memorialized. They call it George Floyd Square now. And it is a square. It's about 4 blocks have been kind of blocked off on that corner. So you can't even drive through there. When you go in that area, as soon as you step foot on the ground, you can feel the energy of the crowd. And every time I've gone down there, it has been crowded. It has been jam-packed with people memorializing and just walking around and looking at the artwork, finding ways to pay homage to George Floyd and to all of those who've lost their life due to police violence.
And there's something about grieving and grieving collectively. I mean, there's a reason why we have memorial services. We need to come together and be in community. With George Floyd's murder, it feels like we're still in that memorial service. We're still trying to figure out what does this mean and how are we going to be different with each other And, I was so moved by his daughter and the new artwork that went up at the square with, Daddy's going to change the world. I mean, that's the hope that you were talking about in the last segment. I mean,
Yes.
how can we hope to see something different out of this? How has something that happened in Minneapolis impacting a global?
Yes.
And as we grieve, how might we be able to encourage more of the world for us to all grieve together, to keep having that time out to go, what does this mean? What change can happen because of it?
Right.
Well, we talked about doing the stages of grief and applying them to racism. And so, Melissa, I'd love to have you share, as I go through each of these, how each of the stages of grief, which I'm sure folks have heard of, it was first initiated in terms of looking at being diagnosed with cancer, looking at those stages as well as accepting those who have passed. And the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Melissa, share with us how denial, and we've sort of hinted at it, but help us more clearly understand how denial is the first stage of grieving and how that applies to racism.
Well, denial and racism can look like white folks enacting white supremacy by telling people of color that they're making a big deal about racism.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make a big fuss. And, I always tell people each of us is an expert in our own life experience. So if I come to you and I say, hey, I think I just experienced racism, and I'm a black person and I'm telling this to you as a white person, it's important for you to believe me. Jane Elliott said, white people don't believe that racism is happening because it's not happening to them.
And they haven't been impacted by it.
Right. Or just simply that, well, I haven't experienced racism, so the world must not be a racist place. Well,
or that happened so many years. That was 400 years ago. We can't keep reliving the past.
Right.
My ancestors has nothing to do with who I am today. So, why do we worry about that is part of the larger denial. But even in the denial, there's some grief, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge is that people think that denial is bad. But the denial stage in grief can help you prepare for the emotions to come.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not saying that denial or denial of grief related to racism is good, or that you should try to hang out in a denial
No,
space.
but it's seeing the opportunity.
Yeah.
That there's an opportunity
think
to help people get to the next level if they are in that
Right.
denial, and not just dismiss them and expect that they'll never get it since they're in the denial stage, but just be able to recognize, oh, they're in the denial stage.
Or
Okay.
just for yourself to
Yeah.
think of it as a pause that allows you to begin healing from loss.
Mm-hmm.
Once enough time has passed for you to begin processing and understanding what you've experienced, you potentially will move to the next level.
And the next level is anger. And you
We
mentioned,
all are angry about racism,
yeah, well,
right?
and you mentioned that even in the last segment about how it can also be an escape mechanism. If you're just angry but you're not doing anything about it, then you've
Right.
just stayed in the anger stage.
And then when you're in that anger stage, you feel pissed off and upset. You're frustrated and irritable about racism. And anger can also be expressed in subtle ways that can mimic the denial stage, which is super important. Like feeling irritable and frustrated, but ignoring these emotions or feelings, or feeling confused about why you're feeling that way. But anger, when you really think about it, is an opportunity to say, wait a minute, something's wrong here, and I think we need to do something about it. So we have to take a stop and say, and stop and look approach,
Mm-hmm.
right? Why am I angry?
And what is that? What's underneath it?
Right.
And we might get angry at one thing, but realize, no, we're really angry about something else. And it goes back, I think, to even what Kent was saying earlier about are we angry perhaps at our heritage for having this happen, and how do we sort through it now? What do we,
Yeah. And then you have to be careful, right? You don't want to get so angry that it overtakes you,
Right.
right? And I think you need to do something with those feelings of anger. You can journal, you can do art, you can write a book or write a story or interact with other people who are in the community who are doing work towards that justice that you're seeking.
Especially, I think connection. I mean, I know it's Connections radio show, but there is something really important that you take your anger, because anger can be isolating, and
Yes.
find ways to connect. What is
Yes, with others.
Yeah, what can we do? Because I think the access point of anger is something you have to be moved to do something. It's alerting you that something has to change.
Yes.
There's something amiss. So you can
Yeah.
either stay in this frustrated state or you're going to do something.
And there was this old movie. I remember this movie. I forgot what it was, but it was about this anchor who had decided to change. He was a television anchor.
Yes, I'm
And
mad as hell.
His line was, "And I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore."
Yeah.
And that is when anger turns to action.
Yeah.
It is beautiful to take that power and energy.
And that
turn it
action,
into
though,
good.
can then be a realization of what can I do? So you start to bargain.
Right.
Okay, all right.
And yeah.
There-
Well, bargaining is interesting too. And when we're bargaining with racism, it's that what if I had done something differently?
Yeah.
Right. What if I would have said this? What if I would have said that? It's also a little bit of, did you just say that?
Yes.
No, you didn't just say that.
Yeah.
He didn't just say that.
I think it's
Keep
also a place.
bargaining.
We were talking earlier about how humor, the bargaining stage can open you up to like seeing two weird things not supposed to be
Yes.
together, and you start to find humor and discomfort in that. Like, wait a minute.
Right.
Yeah.
And Lori, we were saying, I was telling you that humor, we got to bring some humor into our lives, even as around this conversation of racism, to bring some levity to it. And bargaining is definitely a place where you could say, no. You remember they used to say, "Oh, no, you didn't," right? "Oh, no, you didn't just say that," right?
But you can do that bargaining and you can do that humor when you've established the connection, when you've established a relationship, I think.
Yes.
I think
that makes a lot of sense, Lori. You're
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Because if I can bring some levity to it and make it a teachable moment because we're friends, you might take it differently than if I say something and you're not as close to me, or we don't
Right.
have that trust.
Right. But we also know that moving out of bargaining, if we see that nothing is happening, that even though we've tried to do action, we can go into a depression or we can feel overwhelmed. That
And I think bargaining, if you see that bargaining happening and you realize, no, that was racist,
yeah,
it takes you into that stage of depression.
yeah. And recognizing that sometimes you need to take a moment and pause, and that depression allows us to get in touch with the depth of the pain. And
Yes, and
that's
that's
important.
where that's where the crux of it is. As we are on this journey, and as the stages of grief progress, you're able to feel more and more vulnerable emotions, and these are the emotions that are underneath the denial, the anger, and the bargaining.
And I think in depression, and again, people sometimes, make depression bad, and just like they make grieving bad. But depression, I think, allows us to center ourselves and find our authentic self, so that when we move out of the depression, we have, searched our soul and we've got our authentic reaction. That in that acceptance, more of who we are can be voiced, because we have taken that journey inward, and we've found the pain, we've confronted the pain, and we've accepted that we will have this pain in our life, but we are compelled to accept and do something more, and use our voice in different ways.
And it's interesting too, as we compare with the grief the 5 stages of grief and we think about this and as it relates to racism, it's different. Because if you have someone that you love that passes away, or even if you lose a job or something, these things are like single loss related, right? But with the permanence and systemic nature of racism, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to see that racism will end, right?
Yeah.
And when you get in that stage, that is when it's important for you to reach out
Yes.
and remember to connect with people who can remind you that there is hope and that there is healing from racism and that it's a journey.
And we're going to make that our final thought for this segment. And in our next segment, we'll talk about what can be our role. And as we've looked at going through the stages, how do we name what stage of grief we may be in and what we want to do to move forward? So thank you for joining us, and we'll continue our discussion in just a few minutes, and we'll continue the journey then. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. So glad that you joined us today as we've been exploring grieving and racism. And we've been doing it with my co-host and co-producer, Melissa Stanton Adams, who's the president and the executive director of the Stanton Adams Diversity Institute. And we've been going through the Racial Healing Handbook with ourselves, our friends, our a work group that Melissa's got going in her Diversity Institute, and with you who've joined us today. So thank you for being a part of that. And this week we've been talking about grieving and naming racism. And it prepares us for when we do our next program. The first of the month, is going to be on Raise Your Race Consciousness. And I believe that understanding the grief process positions us to learn how to do things that help us claim our anti-racist identity. We can say that we're anti-racist, but what are we doing about it? And how we've learned about racial history means how it has impacted our life. And in so doing, we're really learning how to connect with others. So in finishing up our session today and looking at grief, what's the big takeaways that you feel that our community would be good to be thinking about before we go into our next session the first Saturday of the month, and looking at raising our consciousness and doing something? But what are some nuggets, Melissa, that you think that we should be thinking about in understanding our grief process and racism?
Well, I think that 5th stage of acceptance is the important one. It was hard for me to think about this stage, but according to Annalise Singh, she says this stage is so powerful to explore when it comes to racial healing. When you accept that racism as a system and structure isn't going away, you can also move into action beyond this acceptance. You can design your new normal, and as being a freedom fighter, either as a white person or a person of color, you can interrogate all you've been taught about the world as you explored in these sessions with Lori and I, and you can create new intentions for your journey in healing from racism.
It's interesting when you just shared that. I had this sense of how is guilt and grief somehow intertwined. How
Yes.
do we work through, is there the sense of ancestral grief that's really tied to feeling about ancestral guilt, being able to embrace our ancestry of who we are, but also deal with the generational challenge that's come down.
We have to accept it.
Yeah.
We have to accept that our ancestors made poor decisions, right? We have to accept that, and we have to move forward from there. But first, let's acknowledge it, validate people's feelings around this, and do it in a compassionate way. And
redefining roles of the traditional and questioning in the traditional. When you share about being able to investigate, being able to look at things differently, being able to take in things differently. If we reviewed how history may have given us one version, but being our own Sherlock Holmes in terms of discovering,
Right.
were there other aspects that I didn't get in class?
Right.
I was amazed
like
that
Tulsa's Black
exactly.
Wall Street, for example.
How that was not taught. I mean, this was a massacre. This was 300
Right.
people.
That's why it wasn't taught, right?
Yeah. So
But we have to do our own investigations.
right, and discover history in a new way.
Yes.
And beyond what maybe our family said, beyond what our school said, beyond what our friends said, how do we experience it now with our own, not looking at it in denial and being able to be more clear-eyed than just anger, that anger gets us going, but being able to work through stages of grief as we even investigate our history.
Exactly. But the most important part of this conversation that we're having, Lori, is that a lot of people after the murder of George Floyd and all of the civil unrest, they decided to do book clubs and they had movie clubs and they had listening sessions. And I am not knocking any of that. I believe all of those things are great.
Yep.
All good. I'm glad people are doing that work. But people need to feel the emotion. We're intellectualizing racism.
Mm-hmm.
I need to see statistics, Melissa. Show me proof that racism exists. We're intellectualizing it.
Yeah.
People need to feel the feelings. If you're a white person and you feel guilt, it's okay. Feel that feeling. Get connected with that feeling and understand, why am I feeling this guilt? And if you're feeling guilt based on some history, that's a good thing. Some people don't have that emotion. Right? They don't have the empathy muscle. So it's important for us to start flexing that empathy muscle as much as we can and have empathy for yourself. You were dealt this hand. None of us asked to be. If I had the choice, would I have been born black or would I have been born white? With the society that we're in, right? None of us had a choice. We were born into these lives. But we do have a responsibility to acknowledge and validate.
And we're going to have to make that our final thought. So thank you, Melissa, for all the guidance that you give and the work that you're doing to make a difference. And all that you share in terms of our wonderful program. Stay with us with Connections Radio Show. Continue on the journey with racial healing. Join us on the next racial healing journey, which is going to be the first Saturday of the month in July. And we look forward to that time together. Have a great week.